Dialogos interpretation of Genesis chapter 1. I'm going to try and produce these at least once a week for a chapter. I might try and break into larger story topics and kind of group them together. But for this first chapter, I definitely feel like it's a standalone kind of chapter. So let's read the verse and then kind of break down how I'm interpreting the verse after I read it, so you guys can kind of get a feeling of intentional reading, I guess is the best way I can kind of describe it right now. You'll kind of see as we go. So let's do it. In the beginning, starting with verse 1, God created the heaven and the earth. So here you can kind of see the heaven and the earth. He's separating the two pieces, the duality that I kind of talk about in my philosophy and kind of the way I think. It definitely is starting to unfold already, creating two separate entities. Let's continue on to verse 2 here. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. So the Spirit of God moving upon the waters. I want you guys to kind of picture here. This is the way I kind of picture it. Really imagine the order and the chaos, the moving on the waters, the potential energy that is kind of surging through the creation of what God is kind of calling into being. So that's all over this first chapter of Genesis, is God speaking potential into things and then them becoming so. But not just God creating them, God working with the will of his creation to create something that is it's a symbiosis kind of relationship where there's two beings that are merged kind of into one being. And that's that kind of like Dialogos that I'm talking about, where, man, this is really abstract to try and explain to people that might not have. We're going to continue on here and we'll come back to this. So the next thing I kind of want to break out from it, talking about the earth being without form and void, where the tectonic plate theory is there's a molten core to the earth and there are plates that are kind of shifting on top of the earth. That kind of imagery is what I see, where the molten core has a crust to it and then there's a bunch of water on top of that and everything is swirling and kind of feeling the potential of what is to come. And maybe even if you can give an inanimate object like an excitement characteristic to it, like its potential of what it could be, that's kind of like the energy that I feel from reading that verse. And that's going to be throughout the entire chapter 1. But let's keep reading and we can keep kind of digesting it. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Only creating light, not darkness yet. So that was the first thing that God made. So, and then chapter 1 verse 4 says, "And God saw the light, and it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness." So that's kind of the darkness in the deep from verse 2. Darkness was upon the face of the deep. That's kind of where things began, was in the darkness. And then God brought light into it in verse 3. And now you can see kind of the duality of God is dividing the light and the darkness in verse 4. As we kind of continue on here. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. and the evening and the morning were the first day. Notice in the first verse, God created light and specifically mentions it was good. God created light and specifically mentions in that verse that it was good. God continues to separate the light from the darkness, then he gives a name to both of them. Giving a name to something speaks power to the existence of an entity. I think that's kind of the best way that I can describe the God calling forth the potential of something to truly be. And then it creates a domain over the entities, because God created the entities themselves. So he's exists in the same universe as the entities, but he's also outside of the universe because he's the one making everything, basically. As abstract and weird as that may sound, it ties into, I think, the Big Bang Theory, where they talk about potential energy and where you can get a singularity forming and have an extreme burst of energy. That's kind of like, that's what this is. That's what this story right now that I'm reading is kind of an interpretation of the Big Bang. And I think that's why, even though science thinks the Big Bang is getting away from God, it ties back in. It's taken the story of the Bible and just kind of applied it to science and said, well, we don't really know, but this is the best theory and it's better than some make-believe pie in the sky God exists kind of figure. And I think that's the wrong approach to this conversation. Science isn't against religion. And if you look back into the kind of Stoics and public figures back in the Roman period, or back when Jesus was alive, or even prior to that, you can kind of you see how they integrate their thought into life and being intentional about life. And Rome was on fire. People, it was on the brink of falling apart. They killed Jesus, and the following 400 years was the fall of the Roman Empire. And that's kind of it's interesting to see, because science was much more skeptical back then, especially when you're kind of considering the nocebo and the placebo effect. And Jesus was alive. Most religions believe that Jesus existed. Not all of them believe that he came to pay the ultimate price so we could all be saved from hell. But they do agree that he was a good person. If you look at Islam, that's something. Judaism, depending on who you talk to, maybe in the religion of Judaism, but many believe that Jesus came and was a good guy, but he just wasn't the savior that they were waiting for. So, a little bit of a tangent there. Sorry, this is kind of the process when I read, where my brain skips to and what I pay attention to as I'm reading. So we're going to go on with verse 6 here. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." So kind of spinning off of that Big Bang that I just talked about in science, this is where God is creating the universe, the planets, not the stars, because the stars provide light. But here he's pulling out, I feel like, so the molten core of the earth, God is pulling chunks of material off of the earth to form these planets that he's going to place into the heavens, as you'll see in the next couple verses here. He places them into heaven and kind of divides the earth and the heaven into that duality that we talked about. Kind of again, but here he's pulling out these planets all from just the center core, speaking them into being, and then dividing water too. So that's kind of interesting, which if that's true, then that means that other planets could have water, not life, but they could have water also in the either crust or somewhere on the planet for life. So science will either confirm or deny this as we go, but I definitely feel like it's possible. Not all atmospheres are going to be the same or be able to support life, but if you can find one, and then also there's water potential there, that's humans could exist on multiple planets, which would be pretty cool. So solar system is very interesting if you haven't looked at kind of astrology and stars and how all that stuff works. That was probably one of my top 5, I would say, parts in kind of this journey of figuring out Dialogos. All right, we're going on to 7 here. We got 7 and 8 together, so I don't have any notes in between there. So this will be we'll read through here. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. So here again, where we kind of talked about giving name to the light and the darkness, God speaking to the being of what he's naming, and here he calls the firmament heaven. So depending on people's terms of what heaven is, outer space could technically be considered heaven because they're part of the firmament, but this is one of those, there is no concrete answer. You can go through many different kind of theories of what heaven is in the afterlife versus God creating heaven in this context, kind of in the beginning. So it's like in the beginning, heaven is unattainable for humans, and we're getting to the point where heaven is becoming attainable if you look at like space flight and stuff. So if we can catch up our consciousness to the technology that we have, I think you can see there should be an awakening in people of all religions of kind of the agape love that is talked about by the Stoics. Let's see here, what else is in the notes? So one more kind of duality aspect of this chapter 1 verse 8, and God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. I think this is the duality again of light and dark, the order and chaos. Good and evil is, I feel like it's boxed in too conveniently as good and evil. It's the imperfectness is part of the beauty. And that's kind of the yin and the yang. What you miss from the order, you can gain by the chaos. But too much of order or too much of chaos, and you're derailed and riding in the ditch, as some might say. Verse 9 here. And God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. So now that all the planets have been formed and God separated the waters of the firmament between kind of earth now, and he starts focusing more on earth, kind of crafting it more, separating the land from the sea, and kind of this is calling its existence into reality. So it's a giant mass and pulling the molten core, basically. That's the best way I can kind of imagine how it would be done, is pulling at the molten core and literally pulling so much molten core out of the planet that it hollows it and makes it less dense, maybe, but creating all the structures of land, kind of pulling them up from the deeps towards heaven, which is kind of like an ascension. That'll be another kind of prevalent aspect to what we're reading, is it's always up towards heaven, and there is down and the earth, and talking about that as well in creation. But a lot of what God makes before he makes any beings is this heaven and this ascension to heaven, and bringing things out of the deep and into kind of its potential of being outside of the darkness. All right. Verse 11. And God said, let the earth bring forth grass, and herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. And it was so. And I mean, talk about bringing things out from the earth. So he just pulled the molten core out and created land, and now he's talking, kind of directing the land to bring forth vegetation and seeds that they produce themselves, which is very interesting when you look at the reproductive part of plants and how they work with greenhouse gases and filtering that out of the atmosphere. Very interesting, and probably one of the figuring this out really drove me away from atheism, because I used to dabble in atheism, but the chance of something like the complex human body or your consciousness, trying to put that into a box of chance that just developed over time, is, I think, selling it short is the best way to put it. There's more to it than that. And you can't, it's not some pie in the sky, oh, you need that crutch of religion in your life, which some atheists kind of, they take it as. But this is all just a journey of information. Those are the people that you want to talk to, I think, when you're trying to figure out your spiritual journey. It's not one team or the other, it's just looking at information and trying to be as impartial as possible about the information. And that helped me, I think, a lot as I was figuring out what is truth. All right, verse 12. Oh, we just read 12. Psyching you guys out. We got verse 13. And the evening and the morning were the third day. And God said, let there be lights in the firmament of heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. So the way we think about our solar system is planets and stars, which stars are a chain reaction of heat and light that are giving energy out to individual solar systems. And we know some stars have faded out. We know that the sun is what this is in our galaxy. But when I talk about the firmament and kind of God pulling it apart, I mean, when you look at how big the universe, like what that means, and astrology used to be like pie in the sky, but now that they have these very advanced telescopes to kind of see around, it is, the speed of light is not fast enough for us to be able to quickly study planets and stars. So this is kind of an ongoing physics process, but definitely think about that when you're kind of contemplating like a big bang versus what this story is saying. I mean, if I were to describe what a big bang was, and when this hit me, I was just like, interesting. But this tells the story of the Big Bang, what it probably was, because it was an explosion of energy and potential and beingness that was created by something that existed outside of that. Which, to even think of that is this the only dimension? Are there other universes that God made in his experiment? I mean, that's the kind of stuff that you don't get in the church. They don't look for that. They don't like the mythology, the story of what this is supposed to kind of bring about in your life. It's all just read it, then make some sort of a simile out of a vague metaphor and relate that to your life, and then say this is what you should be doing, or this is how you should be living. And a lot of people don't. I'll give you an example. And I noticed this at a wedding I was at recently. And so we were about to eat, and the couple said, we're going to say the Lord's Prayer before the wedding. And then they also did it before dinner. And both times, it felt robotic to me in the room. They weren't. When you say that kind of stuff and you don't really think about what you're saying, it doesn't have the same meaning as if you're intentionally thinking about each word as you're saying each word and trying to digest language over thousands of years. Anyways, I hope that helps some of you maybe question a little bit. Maybe some of you it'll just sound like I'm speaking gibberish, and that's okay too. It takes a village. And so verse 16, here we go. And God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. So that's kind of the light and the stars in the firmament, as we just kind of talked about, all kind of coming together very nicely. And then also the duality contrasting both. So the greater light, so that's God, right? The greater light to rule the day. And we would be more considered the lesser light to rule the night, because we're not God. We're made in God's image, but we are earthly beings. I think that's the best way to sum it up. We're going to continue on to verse 17. And God set them in the firmament of heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. This is where I started hitting my hiccup when I tried reading this 2 years ago. And the biggest problem for me is, so he gives them dominion, which is synonymous with the story. It makes sense. To rule over the day and over the night. So, and that's the light that he's giving that dominion. And to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. So it contrasts the light from the darkness and kind of separates the two in that duality of yin and yang. Kind of. The other thing is this last little part. And God saw it was good. And when you think about that and the light and the darkness and how that's going to keep coming up as we read through this chapter, but it was good. The existence of the light and the existence of the darkness was good. And this is why I have a really hard time with just willy-nilly saying good and evil. It's not as simple as that. Because God seeing the true good, other people have said that I've talked to about this, entropy is the ultimate good, which means if there's more creation than destruction, that's beneficial for society. But the problem with entropy that because we're not God and you can't see everything. We're going to do this tangent. This is going to be an intense first episode. You guys might want to rewatch this a few times. And for sure leave comments if you have questions, because this is an ongoing process. I do not claim to know everything. I am not an expert, just some other guy trying to figure out what the heck is going on with this story. So, but saying it was good, and as a contrast, it knocked me off my feet. I couldn't, and the duality and the Taoism, I think Taoism gets a lot wrong, but they do the duality concept of Taoism and kind of the love that it talks about. But like Taoism thinks that you can just have multiple partners in your life. And what I would say is, I don't think God made us to have a bond like we aspire to with God. We have that with our significant other. And the Christians and other people disagree about who should be able to get married, but I think the way God works with the Holy Spirit in your life is between you and God. Some people, maybe they disagree with your lifestyle, but that doesn't change the fact that you can live the lifestyle of the way that you want. They may disagree, and if you ask them, they'll tell you their opinion, but that doesn't mean people are going to throw it into your kind of focal point and we're going to do it. They're going to be mad. I think the church really messed up when they tried to be anti-gay and that it was a bad thing. And this is going on a limb, man. A lot of people are going to disagree with this. Jesus says to love people the way you want to be loved. So I have to be very careful with my words. When you're thinking of how someone wants to be loved, the oneness with God that people kind of aspire to, that relationship with God, should be the same kind of thing that you apply to other people. So if you think being gay is wrong, that doesn't mean that Steve, who's gay, is a bad person. You can still love Steve as a person, and for your own kids, teach them, and maybe your kids will surprise you, and maybe that will happen in their life. And it's much better to come to a place of understanding and have open conversations so you can understand the development that's going on in the kid's life and make sure what they're feeling is truly how they feel and it's not being influenced by other people. But doing that, I mean, people live and let live, man. That's what... I hate to do this, but the church lost it, dude. It's the same story of when Jesus came. got so wrapped up with being holy and just and separating themselves from evil and quickly casting things into the evil bucket and don't ask questions about your faith. Sometimes you just have to believe, when Jesus himself says, anyone who cannot receive the word of the kingdom of God like a little child shall never enter. Like, people take that as, oh, you just got to listen to your parents. And it's like, that's not what that's saying. The closer correlation to what that would translate into is kids ask a lot of questions. They want to understand. And people want to Do you think the people that are blowing each other up over bloody sand in the Middle East want to continue blowing each other up in the Middle East forever, indefinitely? Or Israel and Palestine fighting nonstop? Or some of the great, what a terrible word, horrific genocides, whether it's the Nazis or the Russian Revolution with Lenin and Stalin creating propaganda and throwing it out to the people. And then the Gulag. So many people died. And it was in the name of jealousy. Your mental state and your emotions are controllable. Violence should never be, oh, well, maybe there's going to be just some violence, I guess. People that think like that have no concept of what that actually means. Dropping an atomic bomb on a city of people. And then later finding out that the radiation is a designed effect. They could just make a big bomb that could blow everything up, but why not we'll throw some radiation in there just for fun, so that way no one can live there for the next 100 years or longer. Or Hong Kong. China has some problems. And you can't just pretend stuff doesn't exist. We're going through this with the Trudeau protests right now, where the truckers are saying no, they're vaccinated truckers that are there saying no mandates. You can't kick out our buddies. That's what unions they're supposed to do, but you see people that are criticizing that. And it's not duality that's in their life. It's just one. And too much of one, even the light side. Because think about this with this story. We went off on a bit of a tangent there. Sorry, it kind of comes and goes. But even with this story, God existed before the earth existed. And it was only God. No darkness, no any of that. Just God. So God decides to create an existence by bringing forth the potential of inanimate objects that would, in other terms, have no way of becoming what God enabled them to become. That is the central focus of this first chapter, and why it took me 2 years between my very first time I was going to read through the whole Bible. I was going to do it. This year I think I am, but 2 years ago I was going to do it, and I made it here, and I was like, I do not get what I'm reading. So we're going to keep going on. I'm going to try and go a little bit faster here because we're getting up there now. Verse 19, and the evening and the morning were the fourth day. And God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. So what we just talked about with the universe and that whole tangent, here it comes to kind of back into fruition in the text. So he's bring forth abundantly the moving creatures that hath life. So, and that's the waters are bringing that forth, which humans are mostly water. Water is going to be prevalent through the Bible if you decide to kind of read off on your own, or just kind of follow how I'm doing these. But whatever you decide to do, just make sure you read intentionally. Chapter 1, verse 21. And God created great whales, and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw that it was good. So verse 20, he's creating the winged fowl that are in the open firmament of the heaven. So that, like, this is where I think he's creating like angels and demons, which there's much speculation into, do they exist? Do they not exist? I think they do exist. My wife works in a hospital, and the stories you would hear if you worked in that atmosphere would probably make you into a more religious person. I wonder if that's actually true of nurses, that they're actually more religious. Maybe someone will do a study on that, or maybe there already is one. But that feeling, that is what God is creating, and in the earth too. So that may fly, not that all fly, but that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. So there's also other beings that may not fly that are part of the earth. And this is like the Gaia. So many different religions have this kind of being at the start of the earth that helped form the earth and bring about the potential of what the earth could become. And that's what all these creatures, after he makes this, as you see in the next couple of verses, then everything starts getting made. And this is kind of the initial, like the rendering of Earth's potential, I feel like, where he calls the earth and pulls these beings out of it, and then continues on with his creation. And it says, and God saw that it was good. So all of these angels and demons and beings, maybe not demons may have happened after the fall, but it could have, you never know, man. I don't know. That's a question for the ages. We'll leave that one be for right now. You can explore that on your own. But definitely says that it was good at the end. So verse 22, and God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let fowl multiply in the earth. And it says in the earth. So coming back to the fowl and the wingless, because it doesn't say all of them have wings, in the earth makes more sense here. And this is where I sometimes wonder if demons are in the center of the earth, because it's molten, it's very hot. They say hell's very hot. Like, the fowl multiply in the earth. I wonder if this is demons. It could be more earthly spirits, something benevolent, something that's going to kind of help make all these living animals that God's kind of going to call into existence, along with the earth creating its own potential. So, verse 23, and the evening and the morning were the fifth day. And God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind. So here he's speaking to the earth. Let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind. So after the nature of earth, the earth is creating potential that God is speaking into existence for the earth, which is inanimate object made not inanimate, which is very interesting. And then it continues on and it says, so let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing, and beast of the earth after his kind. And it was so. So this is the earth's interpretation. And this is kind of like these last couple ones are like echo the duality. It's coming back once again. But this echo of God saying, bring this forth of your own will, of your own ethos, your own being. And it does. Just from God speaking it into existence, it does. Which says something about God. It's not some dude riding around in the clouds that looks kind of like Jesus. Like the background that you see behind the Amor Fati with the purple kind of potential light, that is more the entity of what I feel like God is. And you'll see this in the next couple of verses. When humans are made, this is what I think God makes, is it's funny to use this as a comparison, but Dr. Evil and Mini-Me. So God's this big essence of purity and being and having domain over everything he's creating right now, and then he creates another being similar to himself before he creates the body. And this is the consciousness it's super common right now to talk about consciousness. And the book that we're reading right now explains that nicely between chapter 1 and chapter 2. I didn't pull this out when I was initially drafting all these notes, but then I started reading a little bit into chapter 2, and then that's when he actually makes bodies for man and woman. But right now, you're basically like a floating entity that's just like hanging out with God as God's making all this stuff, like front row tickets, basically. And that's the kind of representation, that's what I see when I read. We're gonna keep going now to the second verse, and this is where God puts his own spin on it. And it says, and God made the beast of the earth after his kind. So now God's making beasts of the earth that are after what the earth just made. So God watches the earth call forth its potential and make beings after being charged with kind of that positive energy and potential that God gives, and then takes that interpretation and he makes it even more like him. But both beings are allowed to exist. The imperfect beings that the earth has called forth based on God speaking it into existence, the potential. And then now he creates more beings. And cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. So this comes back to the angels and demons. Because if the earth manifested demons, because the light and the dark are always combating, and the earth pulled forth dark, and then God had to introduce a light counterbalance to that. That's age-old question. All right. Verse 26. And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God is working with the earth to create the being of, like, consciousness, your conscious being, because consciousness and your body are intertwined, but they're separate. That duality again coming into play, where you have God's perfection and then the imperfect nature of what being a human is. And both of those coming together in this existence, the light touching the dark. This is the balance that he makes. But mankind has dominion over everything that he makes, and that is what dominion is. People think that dominion means ruling, but I would, in this context, I would actually argue, wow, that was a tough word, actually argue that dominion is like a oneness with God's creation, where we're intentional about our actions to try and preserve as much of creation as we can. Whether that's destroying the seas from overfishing, or trying to find ways that we can have plankton bloom, so we try and repopulate the ocean and have more of a healthy ecosystem and try and regulate that. We're headed into years that we're going to find that the chance that everything just aligned, we'll find out just how much of a chance that actually was as these ecosystems get disrupted and we have to try and innovate our way out of the problems that we've kind of created. Most of it being the fault of big government. But we'll save that one for another day. Verse 27, so God created man in his own image, and the image of God created he him, male and female, he them. So no physical form. We are just floating, swirling balls of magic rainbow dust. All right, verse 28. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over everything that moveth upon the earth. So here we get a little blessing as our astral projected selves, and we're being told to be fruitful and multiply, which fruitful, people glance over this word, but fruitful is, I feel like that's your self-development. As you develop yourself more, your fruit that your development has brought you should be able to be shared with other people to also help them make it to the same rung in the ladder, if you will. Because it's the best metaphor I can compare this to is like scaffolding, where you're constantly assembling and disassembling scaffolding as you try to figure out life. All right, verse 29. And God said, behold, I have given you every herb-bearing seed which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in the which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat. So some people think that the fall of man is what made us start eating animals, and that before then we lived on fruit, essentially. And maybe manna. I mean, God uses manna in the Old Testament, but it doesn't really talk about it. But this is kind of an interesting verse that I haven't fully hashed out. I read it, and that was the first thing that kind of came up to me. But you guys can kind of decide for yourself on that one which way you feel. I would think I eat meat. Confess. I do eat meat. So I am slightly biased on this interpretation, but it does say that the fruit is going to be for meat. So, verse 30, and to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creepeth upon the earth, wherein there is life, I have given every green herb for meat. And it was so. So, a kind of a reiteration of what I just said, where I've given everything green herb for meat. So maybe we were munching on some little bit of THC meat, or maybe we were just eating other things. You never know. Leave that one open-ended on that. Here we go with the end. Verse 31, and it all comes together. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the sixth day. So this is the point in time where God, being a perfect being, sits back, looks at the existence that he's either called to be its full potential, or he's had an active role in creating the potential. I mean, either way, it's an active role, but one is more of otherness. God has his own perception of what he wants to create, but he's also allowing the very thing that he's creating to have its own will, to become what it feels like is its maximum potential. And that is the duality. Once again, my brother and I have a stepbrother. He'll be on this podcast. We're going to try and do maybe 1 hour a week that we release. But he is kind of the yin and yang duality. More atheist. Doesn't really believe in like a religio or a logos, or he believes in consciousness, but atheists have a really hard time defining these words, because the most serious language is this religious language. Like when God talks about the darkness from the light, and he talks about the sea and the land, and that today you're talking thousands of years. Some people think that much longer than that, but that would assume that carbon's half-life never changes, ever, even with extreme circumstances, which we know were possible. I mean, God was a very wrathful God in the Old Testament, and you'll see where the devil, the darkness, tempts the Israelites, and even people who are God's chosen person, that he's chosen to relay a message through, and they have imperfect character flaws. None of them are perfect. 2, I can't remember the name. We'll get into it. I remember the story, but I can't remember the name. But there's one story in the Old Testament of a guy that ascends to heaven on a flaming chariot. I think it's someone who predicted Jesus was going to be born, I think. Don't quote me on that. We'll get to that story. And then the other one is Jesus himself, who dies for everyone's sins and is kind of the equalizer, the conquering of the darkness, that whosoever believes in him God. And this is where I think Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all intersect. Because they just don't believe Jesus was the perfect sacrifice, and they're still waiting for the next sacrifice, the Savior, to come. So, hopefully these readings will be able to be applied to all sorts of religious teachings. Thank you for sticking with me. Hopefully I didn't get too long-winded. I didn't scream. My old guy I used to listen to back when I was a kid would scream and make sure you're awake. So this is much more subdued, but let me know what you guys think. If you think I should get a little bit of pep in my step and get some louder tones, or if this was a good format for kind of being able to process the information. I will see you guys in the next video. Make sure to hit a thumbs up, help the algorithm, make me get found, things like that. Have a good one, guys and gals.